This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hello, good evening.
It is, but it's a good film, isn't it?
Well, hello everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Marxism and Culture Seminar, the first for this academic year. Warm welcome for the very first seminar. My name is Chris Papayannou. I'm one of the organisers here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jonathan Stafford, who has just recently, or last 6 months, completed his PhD at the University of Kingston at the Department of Design, or
Art and Design History.
Art and Design History, okay. And so he'll be drawing on ideas from his PhD tonight. And I'm really, really excited about this project because I think it really encapsulates one of the great things about Marxism and Culture as a seminar is that it's transdisciplinary and it really pushes ideas and agendas in terms of method. And Jonathan's project, I think, is particularly brave and ambitious for a PhD project because it actually tries to follow Benjamin's incomplete and possibly failed method of the Arcades project. So I'm very looking forward and curious to see how that can fail or not. So without further ado, Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thanks to everyone involved in Marxism and Culture. I've been coming to the seminars for years now, so it's quite an honour to be giving one myself. And I begin. The 5th of October 1858 edition of The Times features an article which speculates on the commercial opportunities offered by the island group that today comprises the Indonesian archipelago, reflecting on the potential of what it terms the region's great political and financial importance in the hands of civilized possessors. The setting chosen by the piece's author for the staging of this geopolitical conjecture is the space of a ship, and I quote, "The microcosm of a peninsular and oriental steamer listens with a half credulity to stories of flying monkeys and prodigious serpents and a population of cannibals, while the vessel dashes through an archipelago of islands thickly clad with tropical foliage and canopied with lofty palms. The passengers are looking towards their point of destination and spare few thoughts to the untamed regions that lie upon their path. Yet they are skirting the precincts of a future empire which must at some not very distant day take part in the world's history." In this passage, the geography of the unknown is expressed as a realm in the state of nature, as the habitat of the strange, the sinister and the savage. That in attempting to narrate the penetration of financial markets into new global territory, the article's author poses a speculation from the space of a P&O steamer passing through the island group is thus significant. The steamship operates as an apt narrative device in that it provides the juxtaposition of a space which functions as other to this untamed region. The characterization of this territory as one for which history, and by that I think we can safely read capitalism, was yet to begin, is performed from a space which was able to act as a mobile bearer of the spirit of civilization, of the Western present. In embodying the temporal now of a specifically Western European historical time, the steamship becomes the ideal vantage point for an imperial modality of viewing the world. It is precisely due to the ship's idiosyncratic modernity, I would argue, that it is able to perform in this capacity. I would like this evening to explore the character of this, what one could term a maritime modernity, attempting to account for the steamship's specific character as an alternative site for the interpretation of capital. And to begin with, I should say a few words about the company whose ships form the material of this analysis. In Industry and Empire, his historical study of the Industrial Revolution, Eric Hobsbawm observes the dearth of major corporations to have survived from the Victorian era until the book's time of writing. If we look at the 20 great industrial units of 1965, Hobsbawm writes, we shall find only one which would have meant much to the contemporary of Benjamin Disraeli. This was the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, commonly known today simply as P&O, a company most will be more familiar with as a ferry or cruise ship operator than as one central to the history of industrial capitalism. P&O, officially incorporated by Royal Charter in 1840 to deliver the first steamship communication with the colonial East, provided the main mode of transportation between Europe and its eastern colonies for well over 100 years. During this time, its ships maintained a vitally important logistical system which connected and sustained the fluid functioning of empire. The company had a government contract to run steamships delivering mail from the UK, which in the year of its incorporation was extended to Egypt, in 1842 to India, and to the Far East in 1845. P&O's story is implicated with that of global capitalism, facilitating the reliable and regular transfer of information from the metropole to imperial periphery required by emerging global markets. The period I'll be concentrating on today is the first 30 years, from P&O's inception until the early 1870s. A period of massive change in global shipping, largely through its revolutionisation by the new means of propulsion provided by steam. The historical moment of P&O's incorporation was at a revolutionary juncture in the development of capitalism. As the pressures exerted by the globalization of financial markets were breaking down earlier pre-industrial forms of capital associated with mercantilism, changes which would result in the repeal of both the Corn Laws and the Navigation Act in the decade to come. As well as the ease of circulation of the means of communication, the developing global market was reliant on new configurations of labour. In addition to the mail, P&O's ships were also used to transport the growing class of colonial bourgeoisie, the administrators of empire, the military personnel, and the entrepreneurial class of merchants and capitalists. An increasing number of people were beginning to be drawn into the capitalist world system, and the introduction of steam saw global travel beginning to occur on a relatively large scale. P&O's steamships were able to perform predictable, regular, and repeatable patterns of circulation to colonial ports, a radical departure from the existing system of unpredictable and slow sailing ships. These profound and largely overlooked changes constituted a rupture in the world of maritime transportation comparable to the Industrial Revolution occurring simultaneously upon land. This departure from the past constitutes what I have termed a maritime modernity. I should clarify here with a loose definition of modernity, which, while it by no means exhausts the term, provides a working model. By modernity I mean a set of experiential qualities which are characterized by their relation to capitalism. For example, the rhythm of capital accumulation, inflecting the lived experience of temporality. Accounts of modernity typically tend to privilege urban space as the definitive site of modern experience, particularly paying homage to the metropolis as a material embodiment of the term's conceptual veracity. What I want to suggest is that utilising the environment of the steamship as an alternative site for the explication of modernity offers the opportunity of heterogeneous narratives for the interpretation of capital. Such an approach foregrounds the importance of the material processes of circulation, which tend to be overlooked in favour of production and consumption. This staging of the capitalist world system's explication from the vantage point of a ship, which we have already seen in the Times article, was not a new endeavour. As the late American artist and critic Alan Sekula suggests in the essay Red Passenger, which appears in his 1995 monograph Fish Story, this motif had a pedigree in Dutch maritime painting of the 17th and 18th centuries. However, Sekula chooses to begin this essay with one very specific utilisation of the ship in such a manner, that of Friedrich Engels in the opening pages of The Condition of the Working Class in England of 1844, from which I now quote. I know nothing more imposing than the view which the Thames offers during the ascent from the sea to London Bridge. The masses of buildings, the wharves on both sides, the countless ships along both shores, crowding ever closer and closer together. All this is so vast, so impressive, that a man cannot collect himself, but is lost in the marvel of England's greatness before he sets foot upon English soil. Sekula points out that Engels' use of this movement from the open sea to the confines of the city street as a means for the representation of British commerce is a performative one, whereby it is only in stepping ashore into the squalid, overcrowded streets of London that one can get an idea of the conditions which lie behind the apparent greatness of the most advanced industrial nation's capital city when viewed from the river. This manoeuvre anticipates Engels' historical materialist critique of the representation of capital. The mode of ethnography performed by Engels in his book is one which penetrates beneath the surface facade of the monuments which the modern capitalist state has erected to its own power and glory. This passage also engages with the representability of the historic phases of capital, whereby the movement from the ship to the city is one from the pre-industrial world of merchant commerce into the exploitation and alienation of modern capitalism. This representational motif could be said to contain a certain nostalgia for the legibility of an earlier age, in which the complexity of social relations was not yet as it had become under industrial capitalism. As Sekula makes clear, Engels' use of such a binary polarity could no longer be sustained under the changed conditions which accompanied the age of steam. Over 40 years after the book's writing, in a note to the American edition of 1887, Engels qualifies his earlier assertion. This applies to the time of sailing vessels, he writes. The Thames is now a dreary collection of ugly steamers. What this observation makes explicit is the impossibility for Engels of the steam-driven ship providing the symbolic movement from pre- to post-industrial which the sailing ship was able to perform. With the advent of steam propulsion, the ship was no longer the vestige of an earlier form, a world apart, but had become, like the city, a modern space. However, as I hope to show, this modernity embodied by the steamship was in fact dissimilar in a number of significant aspects to that of the city. Indeed, I would argue, the most mature attempt to come to terms with capital from the perspective of urban space would itself come up against this endeavour as a difficult, fragmentary task in the era of increasingly fluid global mobility. I'm of course referring to the Paris of Walter Benjamin's Unfinished Arcades project, perhaps the most significant exploration of the identification of urban space with the concept of modernity. As what he terms the capital of the 19th century, Benjamin's Paris is a city that in the many fragmentary sources which the arcade is made up of, repeatedly presents itself saturated with images of the ships and the sea. The etchings of the artist Charles Meyron, for example, depict a Paris which is suffused with the waves of the ocean, a maritime city. This is Meyron's Collège Henri IV from 1863 to 4, in which the artist portrays the left bank school poised on the shore of a vast ocean teeming with the masts of ships. The fantastic image of the ocean is again evoked in the prose of Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant, in a passage which was a major source of inspiration for Benjamin's project. The arcade is depicted submerged in the mystical light of the seabed. Aragon's Peasant experiences a vision which he describes as the whole ocean in the Passage de l'Opéra, in which the window of a cane shop in the arcade becomes the phantasmagoria of an underwater world, where, he observes, even the canes floated gently like seaweed. This oceanic affinity, I would suggest, conjured up by a cornucopia of commodity objects, betrays their origins in Paris's connections with global trade. This commodity relation to maritime geographic space is again expressed in Charles Baudelaire's poem Invitation to the Voyage, from Flowers of Evil, quoted by Benjamin in the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, the first long draft of his intended book on the poet. Quote, "See on the canals those sleeping ships, they have a vagabond spirit. It is to satisfy your least desire that they come from the ends of the earth." Those of you who are intimate with the arcades would perhaps argue that the maritime imagery I've described is employed by Benjamin specifically to mobilise the archaic, mythic element in the modernity of 19th century Paris. Although this is true, I would argue that Benjamin's Paris is set against a cataclysmic limit, which, while it is both archaic and mythic, is also absolutely modern. This was a development in the world economy, the intensification and regimentation of the global movement of goods at sea, which was then having an enormous impact upon the spatial politics of Paris itself. The arcade's material, which I have cited, records the face of the Paris which was at that moment being swept away, the obsolete, the static, the decaying, set against the dynamic of these global forces. As such, I would suggest, this ocean which Benjamin's Paris produces in these moments at which the lines between the city and the sea begin to blur and weave together depicts the urban in a structure of relations which are implicitly global. Just as the arcades are haunted by the spectre of the sea, so the global continues to haunt the urban. This point is also one which is central to the argument made by Kristen Ross in The Emergence of Social Space, in which he situates the revolutionary space of the commune in the context of the global space of the expanding world market, depicting a Paris whose geography situates it at the cutting edge of what she describes as the European transformation of space into colonial space. In a letter to Benjamin of the 2nd of August 1935, Adorno wrote of what he perceived to be the shortcomings of the exposé of the Arcades project Benjamin had produced that year, Paris, the capital of the 19th century. For Adorno, the arcades lacked an engagement with the global movement of goods which was becoming increasingly imperative to the capitalist system at that time. The commodity category would be greatly concretized by the specifically modern categories of world trade and imperialism, he writes. Adorno saw the significance of what he termed the compressed distance encountered in the arcades material as finding its root in, quote, imperial conquest. The commodity dynamism, spatial character, and social relations of Paris, which exceeded the confines of the city, bore witness to the expansion of the European imperial project. Adorno relates his critique to what he refers to as the role of the arcade as a bazaar, the collection together of commodities which attest to the global character of social relations. This was, of course, a structure most cogently expressed in Benjamin's preoccupation with the world exhibitions, the great assemblages of commodity objects from across the globe. However, Benjamin's subsequent work on the arcades continued to leave the connection between the exhibitions and the concrete reality of imperialism unexplored. His preoccupation with consumption meant that the sphere of circulation was left underdetermined. The project's final form, a kaleidoscopic collection of fragmentary historical material, bears witness to a metropolis which was beginning to become incomprehensible to its human inhabitants, due in part, I would argue, to its position at the centre of a vast network of circulatory configurations which reach beyond the city into global imperial space. This inadequacy of the urban to express the global nature of capital in the 19th century is articulated in an article in the Illustrated London News' Great Exhibition supplement of 31st May 1851, entitled The World's Highway to the World's Exhibition. This article identifies the Great Exhibition and the development of global steamship routes as inextricably linked phenomena, observing that as, quote, the pathless tracts of ocean have been converted into grand highways for joining the countries they divide, so the terminus of all these great highways has been, without dispute, selected as the most fitting place for the exhibition. This article posits a dialectical connection between the Great Exhibition and the global networks of circulation which make it possible, the relation of the fixed, capacious, and open with the fluid, dynamic, and self-contained. If the Crystal Palace be one of the greatest wonders of the age, the article continues, a greater wonder is that vast and comprehensive system of communication. The Crystal Palace, which attempts to represent a totality, a global cornucopia of commodity objects, is made possible only due to the steamship's patterns of movement. This account refuses the possibility of even the comprehensive interior of the Crystal Palace as being adequate to the representation of capital's global totality. It acts as a critique of the mere semblance of geographic distance suggested by the commodity object. Commerce, the article states, the global exchange of commodities, which it refers to as both a gigantic undertaking and a holy mission, is, quote, and apologies, the English in this quote is a little hard to follow. Commerce is represented only to the mind's eye in the Crystal Palace. To the spiritual eye only can it be represented, for the vessels engaged in it, if placed in one continuous line, would extend to about 3 miles, and the aggregate number of miles steamed by them every year is more than 6 times the distance between the Earth and the Moon. This passage hints at the very impossibility of the representation of capital's global scope, which, it suggests, is only conceivably manifested through an appreciation of the immense scale of the operations of the vessels involved in its circulatory practices, a scale which strains at the limits of capital's representability, and indeed global space itself. This expansive, excessive portrayal of capital is an attempt to account for its global character, a geographic reach which even the Crystal Palace is not adequate to. The 19th century revolution in mobility was the extension of capitalist modes of accumulation into ever wider circuits of exchange on the world market, and as such constitutes a significant moment in the history of globalization. Globalization is marked by the breaking down of the local character of social relations, as capital drives beyond spatial barriers to draw more and more global actors into an integrated system. How can this historical moment be grasped through an analysis of urban space? Capital's integrated world system exceeds the representational forms of the city, and as such the urban cannot bear witness alone to its complexity. My argument is that the abstractions of exchange which occurred at this time can be more completely understood by also taking into account the material history of the colonial steamship. Globalization, the totalizing force of capital, finds its purest expression in a hysteria for movement. While the buildings and monuments of the great cities seem to convey an ideology of order and permanence, the steamship is inherently mobile, transitory, and rapidly obsolete. It presents itself as the other side of modernity's coin. Thinking modernity as a global dynamic phenomenon places the steamship at the centre of debates concerning modernity's production at a world historical level, thinking about the representation of capital from the perspective of circulatory systems, the dynamic space of flows. In observing that the city is no longer the singular site of meaning and attempting to come to terms with capital, I am, however, somewhat belated. A number of attempts to think our contemporary historical moment, the postmodern, have concentrated less upon urban space than upon the global space of flows, which characterises what has been termed our networked society. As Alan Sekula remarks in Red Passenger, quote, "There is no longer a city at the centre of this system, but rather a fluctuating web of connections." Postmodernity has largely been exemplified by its constitution through a globalised network system of flows. Central to theories of globalization is the characterisation of the 21st century by the transitoriness and mobility of social relations, which are constituted and staged at a remove from the fixity of spatial coordinates. There is a major current of thought which characterises this historical moment as one which is distinguished by a self-fulfilling kinesis in a state of unbounded acceleration, a fibre-optic connectivity in constant flux. Thomas Sutherland has been most perceptive in diagnosing this trend. In his 2013 article, Liquid Networks and the Metaphysics of Flux, referring to a mode of defining the world which has conflated the postmodern conception of immaterial flows with an ontological state which permeates human subjectivity. Such a state of affairs, argues Sutherland, posits the accelerating tendencies of capital as an ontological inevitability, thus discounting resistance to such forces. With Sutherland, I would argue that this theoretical paradigm is guilty of a critical error. Flows do not, in fact, constitute the lived reality of our historical moment, but are themselves constituted by the complex structural processes of capital accumulation. In this digitised age, it is apparently easy to forget the materiality of our life worlds. The deployment of a theoretical terminology, without apprehending the complexity of concrete social reality under capitalism, its actual historical specificity, risks identification with the processes of capital accumulation which underlie the network society it seeks to criticise. These flows have come to be seen as inevitable, constitutive of existence. One positive element of the preoccupation with flux and acceleration is that it has focused attention on the sphere of circulation, which has hitherto often been neglected in favour of production and exchange. The movement I have described of the representation of capitalist society from the urban to the maritime, the space of flows, echoes a similar development found in Patrick Keeler's Robinson films. While the first, 1994's London, had attempted to come to terms with the metropolis from the perspective of the urban modernity of the 19th century, its 1997 sequel, Robinson in Space, begins from an assumption regarding the apparent lack of manufacturing economy in 90s Britain. The film traces this lacuna down narrow country lanes to massive automated container ports where colossal quantities of anonymous cargo are imported and exported every day, despite employing only a minuscule workforce. What the peripatetic spectator of Robinson in Space testifies to is the remove from the majority of people's field of vision of the everyday experience of the concrete reality of capital, the vast movement of goods at sea. Alan Sekula, in tracing this trend, that which he diagnoses as a cultural forgetting of the sea, from the introduction of steam-driven ships to the processes of containerization, problematizes a structure of ontology whereby the material constitution of our lived world is obfuscated to be replaced by the mythology of immateriality and of ephemerality I have already described. Despite over 90% of global commodity flows still taking place by sea transportation, there has been an ignoring of this material process, giving way to an immaterial, disembodied conception of global circulation as one of fibre-optic instantaneousness. Thomas Sutherland argues that an excessive ontological emphasis upon the fluidity of capital results in the myth of what he terms friction-free capitalism, an ideology which imagines space as topological, abstract, homogeneous, ignoring the materiality of processes of production and circulation. Alan Sekula's Red Passenger promotes a sustained preoccupation with the maritime as a means to explode this myth. He argues, quote, for the continued importance of maritime space in order to counter the exaggerated importance attached to that largely metaphysical construct, cyberspace, and the corollary myth of instantaneous contact between distant spaces. Sekula points out that today it still takes around 8 days for a cargo ship to cross the Atlantic. This is roughly only half that taken in the early 1840s by the first steamship to perform a regular scheduled transatlantic service, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Great Western. In In actuality, the acceleration of the majority of concrete flows has seen only a doubling in velocity in over 150 years. Bringing the material to bear on what is often abstract speculation means paying attention to the points of friction in the system, the inertia inherent in the concrete. Hartmut Rosa's 2013 book, Social Acceleration, A New Theory of Modernity, documents the kind of ontological acceleration which prevails as the dominant discourse of modernity. The book's cover is adorned with a closely cropped reproduction of J.M.W. Turner's celebrated 1844 painting, Rain, Steam and Speed, depicting a steam train dynamically forging its way into the picture, an image frequently mobilized as a personification of the revolutionary transformations associated with 19th century modernity. I would like to ask what it might mean to posit a modernity which does not find expression in Turner's train, but rather one which could be considered from the perspective of a painting he produced 2 years earlier. This is an image of the P&O steamer Oriental, the first ship purchased by the company in 1840 to fulfill its Southampton to Alexandria contract. What could a theory of modernity, which rather privileges the second Turner image, tell us? Concentration on the persistent signifiers of speed prevents critical thinking, which is other to the dominant narrative of acceleration. Paying attention to the early history of regulated global flows means reasserting the primacy of the material in this narrative, documenting the instantiation of abstract concepts through their actual enaction in material processes which are tangible but obfuscated from concrete social experience. I would like to argue that the early history of P&O stands in a critical relation to the discourse of friction-free capitalism, serving as a counter-narrative to such philosophical fatalism. Then, as now, the repetition of systems of flows functions to normalize capital, preventing any thinking outside of its logic. Christian Fuchs' 2011 characterization of the contemporary historical situation in his book Internet and Society as a, quote, global network capitalism in which money, commodities, people and information are processed globally at high speed, a fairly recognizable description, resonates with a report from the Illustrated London News of March the 31st, 1849. This brief report observes that, quote, the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company's ship, Ripon, arrived with the East India and Mediterranean mails on Wednesday, bringing 118 passengers, specie, value £35,000, species money in the form of coins, and a large cargo. This seemingly banal statement narrates the concrete movement of money, commodities, people and information through global space at a time when this process was still implemented as a unified system. This early moment of reliable, repeatable circulation on a mass scale of P&O's steam-driven mobility revolution now appears inelegantly materialist, almost clumsy in the common circulatory space shared by these four categories of cargo. However, P&O's employment of steam as a means of propulsion removes some of the barriers to this central demand of global capital, the free movement of objects through space. As I have already observed, Alan Sekula places the advent of steam shipping at the beginning of the processes which culminated in the obfuscatory regime of containerization. P&O provides a kind of ur-history to our current situation. Interrogating such a claim means ascertaining just what was at stake in the entry of steam into shipping. What was the distinctive character of the steamship's modernity, and to what extent can it be seen as a radical departure from the past, from the circulatory logic of sail? An article from the Leisure Hour of the 5th November 1857, in attempting to convey the revolutionary changes brought about by P&O's intervention of steam into navigation, mobilises the vocabulary of a modernity which is subject to constant transformation and instability, a present in continuous flux. In doing so, a number of crucial aspects of what it is that makes P&O's contribution to the culture of modernity significant are articulated. We live in stirring times, claims the article. All is now bustle, motion, progress, change. Immediately what is at stake is a periodization, characterized by four signifying qualities of modernity. Locating the steamship at the center of this relentless process of flux and renewal, the article recognizes the role played by this new technology in a radical reappraisal of global movement, and places at the center of this concern the overcoming of distance by the means of steam. The article continues. In days of yore, our worthy sires, in this sea-girt isle, seldom travelled far from home. Not so now. Steam has changed all that. These are the days of rapid, easy, economical transit. Oceans are now bridged, and distance is well nigh destroyed by the wonder-working achievements of human intellect and skill. This passage evokes some of the central implications at stake in the place of the steamship in the culture of modernity. Technological change is specifically comprehended within a framework of historical transition, as a pre-industrial past is invoked in order to emphasise the revolutionary nature of this departure. The technology of steam is characterised as the vehicle of this historical transition relative to and in tension with the autonomy of the human as an agent of change on the historical stage. The description of the violence of the speed of geographical movement, which is identified as a pivotal concern of the era, resonates with what Marx famously termed the annihilation of space by time. The overcoming of a given distance as a spatial barrier to exchange through the reduction in time taken to travel that distance. That is to say, again, an increase in speed. Marx would clarify this position in the context of the move from sail to steam in shipping in Capital Volume 3. The chief means of reducing the time of circulation is improved communications, he writes, emphasising the pressure of value creation on the reduction of circulation time. Capital acts to revolutionise the means of communication, affecting a situation whereby, Marx continues, on sea the slow and irregular sailing vessel has been pushed into the background by the rapid and dependable steamboat line. However, I would argue that this emphasis upon acceleration obfuscates more significant aspects of what was going on in the departure from sail. Marx recognised the central role played by steam in the revolutionisation of transportation. In a letter to Russian economist Nikolai Danilson of the 10th of April 1879, he wrote that he considered, quote, steamships for oceanic intercourse, along with railways and the telegraph, to be the means of communication adequate to the modern means of production. The introduction of steam power into shipping constituted the industrialisation of the production of locational change. However, at the nascent stage in their development, steam-driven ships were not common, and in fact it wasn't until 1883 that the tonnage of British steam vessels surpassed that of sail. In the mid-19th century, the technology of steam propulsion was rudimentary, engines and drive systems were inefficient and prone to technological failure, and until near to the end of the century, steamships would still possess a complement of sails as an auxiliary means of propulsion. Steam power was thus not yet a practical choice for the majority of ocean-going traffic. It was expensive, relatively unreliable, and limited a ship's cargo carrying capacity. The enormous engines and vast supplies of coal required by their boilers took up such a huge complement of the ship's storage capacity that there was very little space for anything other than high-value but low-volume freight. Hence, the main use of steam in its infant stage for the carriage of the important but relatively insubstantial cargo presented by the mail. The preconditions for the emergence at this early stage of steam shipping were thus the cooperation of monopoly capitalism and state subsidy, whose needs were served by improved communications. The early use of steam did not thus present a revolution in the movement of goods. It wouldn't be until the late 19th century before steam vessels could provide a viable means of carrying anything other than high-value, low-volume freight, mail, money, opium, silk, the colonial bourgeoisie. Bulky cargo which demanded little urgency thus remained the domain of sailing vessels, which would sail between Britain and the East irregularly based upon demand. Sailing ships' voyages also tended to be seasonal, relying upon trade winds which were restricted to certain times of year. Referring in the Grundrisse to pre-industrial technologies of water-based transportation, Marx observes that, quote, the sea route, as the route which moves and is transformed under its own impetus, is that of trading peoples par excellence. While the steamship was the technological form of transportation appropriate to the conditions of industrial capitalism, Marx associated the sailing ship with an earlier age. The circulatory patterns of merchant capitalism relied upon existing rhythms of circulation, specifically the seasonal trade winds. The question is thus, why did industrial capitalism need to overcome these rhythms in order to impose its own patterns of circulation upon the globe's surface? The huge East Indiamen, the merchant sailing vessels used by the East India Company to exploit its monopoly of eastern trade, built for cargo capacity rather than speed, sailed around the southern tip of Africa to reach India, sometimes taking more than 6 months to complete the journey. They provided an unreliable, unpredictable, and slow means of communication which could be said to embody the mercantile era. While the velocity of the steamship was in actuality often little more than that of a sailing vessel, their means of propulsion meant that they were no longer restricted by the contingency of the elements which had constrained sailing ships, enabling them to leave port without having to wait for a favourable wind, and to progress through storms which would render sailing ships incapacitated, indeed often dangerously so. For the facilitation of transport to the global east, steam proved irresistible despite its drawbacks. It offered not just a more reliable, predictable means of transport, but enabled an entirely novel pattern of geographical movement. I don't know if everyone can see it, but a sailing vessel would come down here and around Africa, and in fact they would actually go closer to South America than it's made apparent here, because there's lots of contrary currents coming up the west coast of Africa, and then start heading east here and come all the way up here to India. The use of steam enabled this route here through the Mediterranean, across the Egyptian landmass, down the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean. Until the building of the Suez Canal in 1869, P&O were moving everything across the Egyptian landmass by initially canal boats and horse and cart, and later they managed to pressure the Egyptian government into building a railway. Sorry, one moment. So the P&O steamers made possible a channel of movement which became known as the overland route. As the Red Sea was near impossible to navigate by sail, this route represented a new geography of transit facilitated by steam. The introduction of steam power as a form of propulsion in colonial shipping meant that an unpredictable voyage around the Cape of Good Hope of between 3 and 6 months could be supplemented by one of under a month and a half, which was able to stick to regular standardised timetables. Steam brought about a world which wasn't simply smaller, but which we thought increasingly as a coherent imperial world system. The ability of the steamship to move with equal ease in any direction gave rise to the perception of the sea as an isotropic space, a topological plane of movement providing a vector for the free flow of goods. Logistics, the efficient movement of a variety of cargo through space, has of course its roots in the exigencies of warfare. The legitimacy of such a claim is substantiated by an article in the Times of 19th January 1854 regarding the building of the new P&O steamship Himalaya. The Himalaya was, at the time of its construction, the largest steamship in existence, and was widely lauded for its great size and speed. The article recognises that the ship's capacity for the spontaneous locational change of large cargoes on a global scale was responsible for a radical shift in spatial politics. Written during the period shortly before the Crimean War, the article recognises the new technology's potential for application to warfare in the rapid movement of a large number of troops or ordnance into a critical position in the field of strategic deployment. Quote, "The possession of such a stupendous steamship as the Himalaya must be a matter not merely of local, but rather national interest. If, unhappily, the threatened war should break out, there is no telling the uses to which this vessel might be applied. 3,000 men could be embarked at Southampton and conveyed by the Himalaya in 11 days to Constantinople or the Black Sea. A small army might in fact be rapidly thrown upon any particular point of the European or Asiatic coast. For rapidly transporting immense supplies of provisions, ammunition, artillery, of men to the fleets in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, or in the Baltic, it is difficult to say what enormous services might not, on emergency, be rendered by a few steamers such as these. Force is expressed here as the capacity for the rapid distribution in space of the raw materials of warfare. The strategic advantage of the control over locational change reveals that the steamship is always already a means of controlling territory. Transportation is recognised as the strategic logistics of imperialism. The Himalaya was in fact used extensively in the Crimean War as a troop transport ship in an arrangement which formed part of P&O's mail contract, whereby the company's ships were made available to the Navy in times of war. This relation emphasises the extent to which P&O's story is inextricably linked with that of the British imperialist state. However, it is imperative not to overstate the significance of logistics as a means of understanding capital flows. Logistics acts as a pertinent image for those who wish to believe that capital operates like a battlefield, which with up to the second needs being met fluidly and on demand. In fact, the ability to spontaneously maneuver large cargoes relies upon a system of anticipation which is predicated upon the system's predictability rather than its speed. Objects in space don't move isotropically in response to spontaneous desire, but repetitively in patterns whose spatial and temporal behaviour are predetermined. In the section dealing with credit and fictitious capital, in Volume 3 of Capital, Marx reproduces at length a quote from the Manchester Guardian of November the 24th, 1847. This passage, pertaining to one of a number of practices of fabricating fictitious capital, relates the use for this purpose of timed bankers' drafts, documents whose value could be redeemed upon the arrival of the shipments of goods they had been used to purchase some time before. The Indian house of a trading company was thus able to purchase commodities by this method, to be sent to England around the Cape of Good Hope by sailing vessel, which could often take many months to complete their journey. The shipping documents were then sent rapidly to England by steamships on the overland route and could be redeemed by the company through pawning the drafts with a London bank, well in advance of actually having to pay for the goods. What I would argue is significant for Marx in this passage is that the utilisation of the overland route marked the simultaneous existence of two heterogeneous structures of temporality in the context of the capitalist mode of accumulation, uneven development in the field of circulation. The practice described renders explicit the entering into of a new kind of temporality, one distinct to that of traditional commerce, the circulatory patterns of merchant capital. Steamship time is rendered in opposition to that of sail as the temporality particular to industrial capital, as steam facilitating new forms of complex global financial instruments which, it is worth noting, still rely upon the concrete movement of goods. What is revealed by this practice as regards the revolutionary historical departure associated with steamshipping is that this break is of a specifically temporal nature. The mobility revolution realised by steam was achieved not through the frantic acceleration which typifies that narrative, but rather through the agency of regularity and bureaucratic administration. As steamships were no longer constrained by the contingency of the elements which delimited the movement of sailing vessels, for the first time sea voyages could be made predictable and run to established regular schedules. This state of affairs was unprecedented in maritime transportation, as steam vessels could both advertise their precise departure time and date, sailing ships could often wait in harbour for days awaiting a favourable wind, and specify their voyage's duration. This historical departure marks the inception of a new circulatory regime, governed by its own temporal structure, marking the reconfiguration of concrete social reality as a sphere of being which rested upon predictable structures of temporal rigidity. The obsessively meticulous attitude towards temporal precision with which P&O vessels' movements were administered is articulated in an 1852 article which describes the departure of the steamer Bentinck from Southampton. Quote, "Every point of the 10,400 miles which lie between Southampton and Hong Kong is as rigidly timed as if it were stationed upon a short line of railway. The accuracy and punctuality with which each single mile is performed out or home operates upon the punctual delivery of the mails in China or in London. The Bentinck must, therefore, start at 2. This description plots upon the contingency of the immense arbitrariness of global space, the rigid temporal structure of the railway timetable. Global networks of communication, which rely upon a rigorous predictability, inject into shipping a new sense of temporal urgency. It is imperative that the steamship begins its journey at the time premeditated, precisely because it has entered into a network of relations which are global in character. Spatial distance is subsumed under time, not as an increase in speed per se, but as a quality which is overcome rather through the ability to predict measures of distance in their relation to time. Only through an absolute fixation with temporality, with an adherence to the disciplining of time, could P&O maintain the circulatory practices required of it by capital. A journalist writing for the Asiatic Journal and Monthly Register in an 1843 article entitled "Communication with the East" was struck by the importance of temporal discipline to the new means of transportation facilitated by P&O. The journalist observes, quote, "One of the most indispensable conditions of this new mode of communication is that it shall be secure and regular, not liable to disturbance or interruption, which is more immediately as essential to it than its acceleration. Regularity is here established as a principal facilitator of maintaining global communication networks over and above the property which is more often considered to be the prime factor in effecting this social change, the property of a quantitative increase in velocity. The normalization of the process of circulation occurs through temporal regularity and repetition. Here velocity becomes secondary as a mode of effecting more efficient global mobility, subordinate to the general condition of predictable reoccurrence. The reduction in the length of time taken for circuits of communication to complete themselves is understood to be contingent upon bureaucratic precision as a precondition. This is related to the regularity that steam is able to maintain in its overcoming of the sea element as barrier. A given cargo can be delivered repeatedly and reliably at a specified interval throughout the year. The means of communication provided by steamships is an industrial one, tied to the new capitalised modes of accumulation whose very radicality was temporal in their nature. In the Grundrisse, Marx outlines this departure in the productive process. The constant continuity of the process, the unobstructed and fluid transition of value from one form into the other, or from one phase of the process into the next, appears as a fundamental condition for production based on capital to a much greater degree than for all earlier forms of production. For Marx, capitalist processes of accumulation relied upon the minimization of periods of waiting, that not only is there a regularly repeated process and thus a shortened period during which capital is inactive, but that processes can be planned to coincide based upon the predictability provided by precise scheduling. What is significant about this passage is that it recognizes and promotes an alternative to straightforward acceleration in itself, specifically the production of a state in which value can continuously enter into a process of valorization. This was an internal necessity of capital, one which could only be facilitated by the industrialization of the process of circulation, the steamship. The constant continuity of circulatory movement was a precondition of capitalist imperialism, of the market domination of global space. However, this regularity is not the product of free market capital. Laissez-faire is far too anarchic to create such conditions. This temporal discipline is that of state control through subsidy. As I've said, P&O operated under Royal Charter, funded by a number of government mail contracts which demanded precision and punctuality. The company's relation with the nation-state comes to be expressed at the level of temporality. In an 1867 parliamentary debate regarding the possibility of certain steamship routes which had until then been operated exclusively by P&O being put out to tender, potentially resulting in their implementation by the French line Messagerie Impériale, the Member of Parliament for Wick, Samuel Lang, expressed certain misgivings. Articulating this anxiety in terms of the processes of temporal discipline, Lang declared that, quote, "There is nothing, I am satisfied, that tends so surely to keep at the name and the influence of England in the East as the sight of those splendid steamers coming and going with the regularity of clockwork." Temporal predictability is here defined as the precondition for the visual culture of imperialism to operate as a symbol of domination. In precise repetition, clock time governs the visual rendering of imperialism on a global field. The nation-state, functioning in its role as the regulator of capital, provides the conditions for the stability of circuits of global circulation upon which capitalism relies. The rigid temporal structure of industrialized shipping is in fact the reflection in time of the structural logic of capital, its compulsion not to accelerate, but rather to repeat. Thank you.